Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. We focus on benchmark CG 3.5, explain the amendment process outlined in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. In Part 2, we focus on students identifying the importance of a formal amendment process and will recognize the significance of the difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution. We focus on benchmark clarifications number 3 and number 4. Benchmark clarification 3 focuses on identifying the importance of a formal amendment process, while benchmark clarification 4 focuses on recognizing the significance of the difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution. Why is a formal amendment process both important, while it is also significant and difficult? It is important for us to examine these three aspects of the amendment process to gain a fuller understanding of why the amendment process was created the way it was in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. First, let's focus on the importance of a formal amendment process. We see here lawmakers who sponsor amendments to the U.S. Constitution beginning in 1999 all the way up through 2017. Now, what's important here is that there were no amendments added to the U.S. Constitution during the time frame that is presented on this bar graph. The last time that the U.S. Constitution was amended was in 1992, 7 years before the information was collected for this bar graph. What we see is that there has been variability between 1999 and 2017 as to the amendment process. We see, for example, that the low point in this process was around year 2000, where Republicans introduced 34 amendments to the Constitution, but in 2011, Republicans introduced 56 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Comparing this to Democrats, in 1999, there were 23 amendments proposed to the U.S. Constitution by Democrats, but that number increased to 35 amendments proposed in 2011. So we see that the largest number of amendments proposed in the last 18 years for this graph, the 18 years covered by this graph, the largest number was proposed in 2011, both by Democrats and Republicans, and overall. And so it's really important for us to notice how the variation occurs over time, and that consistently Republicans have introduced more amendments to the Constitution compared with Democrats over time, and even in the year that the most amendments were introduced by both Republicans and Democrats, and that was in 2011. What does this tell us about the importance of a formal amendment process? Notice that for the 18 years of this graphic, that there were several dozen amendments introduced in the Congress to amend the U.S. Constitution. Can you imagine what that must be like if any of these amendments got as far as they needed to even be considered by the states? That there would be constant questions about what was in effect at the time, what the requirements were. Think about the amendments that have been ratified in the last 50 years, right? The last amendment ratified said that Congress cannot give itself a pay raise. That certainly doesn't affect us on a day-to-day basis, but the one before that gave 18 to 21-year-olds the right to vote. And then the amendments that came before then had to do with the succession of presidential power in the event that the president is alive but unable to perform his duties. And other amendments in the 1960s included an amendment that gave the District of Columbia electoral votes in terms of running for president and voting for president, as well as eliminating poll taxes, eliminating a tax to be able to vote. These are important changes, both in terms of how the executive branch functions, how the legislative branch functions, how our elections work. And imagine if the amendment process were not so difficult in terms of accomplishing an amendment, how all of these changes might be in effect, and then they might change to something else and then something different in a very short time if all of the amendments that were proposed on this graphic actually had taken effect. Why didn't they take effect? Because the constitutional amendment process has a very high standard that 2/3 of each House of Congress or 2/3 of the state legislatures or their conventions must propose amendments, while 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the state legislatures' conventions must ratify amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Why is it so difficult? Because the Founding Fathers wanted to be sure that there was a process for the Constitution to be treated as a living document that could change with the times. And yet, what if the Constitution changed more often than it should? Think about the bar graph that we looked at a moment ago. If the process were too difficult, the Constitution would be stuck in 1787 when the Constitution was written. Because it was since the Constitution was ratified that we've added the U.S. Bill of Rights. We've added voting rights such that women cannot be discriminated against because of sex, that U.S. citizens cannot be discriminated against because of race when they're seeking to vote, that we've term limited the number of terms or the number of years that a person can serve as president. 2 full terms, but up to 2 years of someone else's term. So that means it's a 10-year limit unless a person serves 2 full terms, in which case they are not allowed to run a 3rd time and try to manipulate the system by serving 2 years of someone else's term after them. But they can serve up to 2 years of someone's term before them and then run for 2 full terms on their own. There is clear evidence that the constitutional amendment process is difficult. 2/3, or what we call a supermajority, must propose an amendment. Now look at our Congress. Our Congress is split between Republicans and Democrats. Every 2 years, there is a change in the number of Republicans and the number of Democrats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. But nonetheless, there's not such a huge change that there is at least 2/3 of one party or 2/3 of another in either House of Congress, let alone both. So this concept of a supermajority is critically important, both if the amendment is being proposed at the national level or by the state legislatures. We also see that the ratification requirements are even higher. 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment in a ratifying convention or in the state legislature. Either way, like proposing an amendment, ratifying an amendment requires a super majority of elected officials or people chosen by elected officials in order for that amendment to take place. This means that for an amendment to happen, there needs to be bipartisan support, and there also needs to be support at the national and the state levels if the amendment is proposed at the national level. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. If you still have questions, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.